everyone. I'm Susan Dackerman, the John and Jill Friedenrich Director of the Cantor Arts Center. And I am here to welcome you tonight to the opening celebration of the Cantor's major fall exhibition, Contact Warhol, Photography Without End, and the two great exhibitions that are being presented at the Anderson Collection as well. Elizabeth Murray, which I hope you've had a chance to see, and Salon Style too. So thank you all for coming to this event tonight. We're going to talk about Contact Warhol this evening. With funding from the President's office, we also, over the last 3 years, have digitized every one of the 3,600 contact sheets and over 130,000 individual exposures, photographs that Warhol took. It was a huge task undertaken by the museum archivist, Amy DiPasquale, who is here.
Yay, Amy! Bravo!
Amy's created an invaluable research tool because using Warhol's written diaries, she has identified people, places, events, and made those contact sheets very usable. You should all check it out online. The archive is online, available, free to everyone. It opened with the opening of the exhibition, so that was a great accomplishment by Amy, her team, and the museum. So, as all of you know, the fundamental mission here at Stanford and at the Cantor is one of teaching, research, and the production of knowledge. An acquisition like these Warhol contact sheets and the negatives provide an incredible opportunity to fulfill that mission. Now, Peggy and Richard, as they began this research, began by teaching a class, and I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking to us about how teaching the class, looking at the materials in the museum, helped shape your ideas about the exhibition, the catalog, and ultimately what you think and what you've produced about Warhol's contact sheets.
Well, first, I just wanted to thank you all so much for coming because, as I said to my friend the other day, Richard and I are like two deflated ping pong balls. We have been talking to each other for 3 years, and
I don't feel deflated.
I feel bent and bruised.
Oh.
And, yeah. But I'm so happy
I feel
to have
enhanced and
new
full.
air. New air in our conversation. So thank you all for coming. So as Susan said, for me, when I am absolutely daunted, as I was when I began to try to put my mind around 130,000 exposures and the rest of my life. I don't know if my beautiful daughter is here, but she is so ready for this opening to occur. But big shout out to Laura. Thank you so much. When I am in deep doubt and feeling daunted, I try to get my mind around it by imagining talking to people about it. I feel that my job as a critic, an artist, as a person in the world, is to find words for what I'm thinking. So I thought, I have a great life. I can teach when I am daunted. So with Richard, we offered a class that was called Warhol, Painting, Performance, and Photography. And it was a way to begin to rethink Warhol's studies because this is the most coherent body of work that has been given by the foundation. And I just want to acknowledge Sam O'Gale is here from the foundation, and thank you so much. That we felt a responsibility. In my view, and Richard I'm sure will give you his view in a minute, Warhol and Picasso for me are the greatest 20th century artists. And I felt an almost ethical obligation to do justice to the gift. And the other thing I thought was, because the foundation could have given it to any number of institutions, the fact that they chose to give it to Stanford meant that we should try to use what is unique about Stanford. And for me, that is this incredibly radical interdisciplinary spirit. And so I'm not an art historian, and Richard really is. I came from performance studies, performance theory. And so it was really from the beginning a way of learning how to talk to each other across our disciplinary habits of mind. And the class really, I think, articulated that for both graduate students and undergraduates.
And I just want to add one actually memory that I have of that class, which was one of my favorite moments, and it repeated in different forms throughout the quarter. But the first one is the one I remember, which is when we often would have Warhol works taken by the museum out of storage and put in the classroom where we were teaching. And so, for example, when we were talking about death and disasters, the students could look, and we could look up at a beautiful fuchsia electric chair. And when we were talking about, I know beautiful and electric chair are a weird combination, but that's sort of Warhol bringing together paradoxes that you wouldn't expect were possible to inhabit the same space. And when we were talking about, I can't remember but anyway, Warhol as a global artist, we had two incredible Mao prints on the wall from the Cantor's collection. And I think a very beautiful thing about teaching art in a university with a strong museum that is open and welcoming of teaching as a form of the production of knowledge, teaching not only to pass the expertise you think you already have to younger, to very talented Stanford graduate or undergraduate students, but actually together to make new knowledge as you are living for the moment you're in the classroom with the art. And I know that's part of Susan's mission for her directorship.
Yeah, that's a really nice thing for you to say, Richard, because I think that what happens in the classroom is often unexpected, and that's what you're saying, that ideas emerge that are part of that chemistry of people sitting and looking and talking together.
Yeah.
And so how did that come to manifest itself on the walls in the exhibition?
Well, I feel like I'm over loud. Like you're not totally audible, and I feel like I'm overly audible. Am I too loud? You're good. Okay, sorry. David just. So I will say I was thinking about a version of this question today, and how would I answer it? It wasn't one of your pre-circulated questions, but I like it.
This is spontaneous. None of this.
Right. It's happening in the moment, just like knowledge does sometimes.
Exactly.
So we actually had the students in our class each write on a different context sheet, and what we had them do was to follow one of the frames, one of the 36 or less, because sometimes there are blanks or duds. But anyway, one of the 36 frames out into the world, like research it, figure out what it was. And so we had one student, Eliza Powers, who actually worked on this dented "Curb Your Dog" sign that Warhol photographed, and it became a whole conversation about not only looking at the overlooked, but looking at things that most people probably don't want to look at. Whether you're a dog owner or not, you probably either don't want to be told something you would do, and if you're not a dog owner, why do you want to think about that when you're? And I think that the fact that that it was dented is part of what appealed to Warhol, and what Eliza discovered is by looking closely and thinking about the context sheet, there were images of trash. There were all these images of kind of the detritus or the kind of overlooked, the margins in a way of the city. And that's what she ended up writing about. And I thought it was a brilliant paper. And I think it went into, we were very committed to having the dog sign, in the show. So please see the Curb Your Dog sign, and I'll just say one other discovery that a student made, that this was the very last work that was added to the show. One of our students wanted to write, and this was from a stitched photograph that was owned, we first saw it from the stitched photograph that was owned by the Cantor, and that is on display, and it's a sign on the side of on the front of a church that says, Our Lady of Perpetual Help Business School. So this church had fallen on hard times and decided this is the 80s, so decided the way to make to stay afloat was to open a business school, and that didn't work. I mean, but
I wonder why.
Right. But it's so typical of Warhol to bring, the sacred and the what is the opposite of the sacred?
Profane.
Profane, thank you. Or as I would put it, God and money, together. And just also, I think, to stop and read. It's pretty small letters. To stop and look. I think Warhol really looks, and that made us look more closely at contact sheets. We thought at first glance, like that trash contact sheet, I don't think I was like, yes, that should go in, And so also I think we taught each other how to look through each other's eyes a little bit. So Peggy would have things that she would present to me, and I hadn't seen what she saw. And I think that's another thing that Warhol teaches is like, you think you know what this is, but maybe you really don't. Have a look at it through my camera's lens.
And we also, just to say, I know we have to run along, but the other part I would be remiss not to say is that 2 graduate students emerged from the class who I saw over there, Lexi and John. Lexi Bart Johnson and John Davies, sorry, both of whom have essays in the beautiful catalog. And it was great to work with them as well. And we should give Alex Nemiroff, I don't know if he's here, he's the chair of art and art history, and he funded them. So. And they did a lot of research. They did a lot of research. At Richard's request.
And Peggy helped me write the letter of request.
Let's go back a little.
Yes, fine.
You mentioned how in looking at the contact sheets, you asked the students to then follow the images. And that sounds like it relates to one of the ideas that you have come up with about the images, in which you've made an analogy to them as being stem cells, that they are in fact this generative force that then enables the production of images in other media. It's such an amazing idea.
Oh, thank you. It was partially because I had the idea, but really as a way to defend myself against Richard, who kept insisting that in the beginning,
yes,
he kept saying these contact sheets, they're not visually charismatic. And I was like, good. I wrote a book called Unmarked. I liked the visually uncharismatic, but I felt that I had to convince him of why these contact sheets really mattered. And so one of the things that I thought of was this idea that is about stem cells, which are the cells that regenerate themselves and can be put into a wide variety of human cells that are injured or need repair. And that idea was very moving to me because I thought that was central to the way Warhol saw his own art. And we also very quickly began to see this amazing circus that went into the production of particularly the pop portraits. So the pop portraits like the Liza, which is one of the first suites within the exhibition, those silk screens are very well known, and they're very tight close-ups. And you have the sense that Warhol, took a camera, went right here, took a photograph, and turned it into a silk screen and made billions of dollars. But in fact, what the contact sheets really demonstrate is what actually happened, what went into the production of that silk screen, and it was the number of people there, and indeed this kind of meta level of people photographing Warhol, photographing Liza. And that's what we've been able to really demonstrate, I think, how this very simple cell, a single exposure on a contact sheet, leads to what we call photography without end. And Warhol himself was constantly recycling, blowing up, transforming, using multiple serialization, and taking the kind of flexibility of photography as a medium as the logic for his production of what is already very well-known work. And so the contact sheets really allow us to tell a much fuller story of Warhol's working method.
And it's really fascinating if you look at in the exhibition, if you look at the image on the contact sheet and then follow the progression of images that Richard and Peggy have shown, you can see that generation of the image play out over and over. It's a really active way of participating in the exhibition.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And I think this idea that we're at a university and we should be sort of thinking about what would science look at? How would science look at this? How would art look at this? And this is what I mean by the interdisciplinarity of the Warhol, of Stanford.
Just one word in
Warhol too.
Or one sentence in my defense. I did use the phrase visually uncharismatic, but that was partially because I couldn't see the damn things. They are 1 inch by 1.5 inch. You will have this experience when you go into the show, because we have left the contact sheets as objects, as the material objects, Warhol's very own contact sheets on display in that way, but we've also blown them up. And I think I'll do what you're doing. In the beginning, it was just very frustrating, not to be able to see. And then when I finally made it out, it was like a bunch of trash, so. Or Liza crawling on the floor. Now later I got really interested in Liza crawling on the floor, but in the beginning.
In the beginning, Richard.
In the beginning, I did know it was Halston's floor that she was crawling on.
Richard,
not Liza.
I know.
It goes back to the white men all the time.
No.
I'm just kidding.
I'm joking.
Just teasing.
I was already
I'm
interested.
just teasing. Yeah.
It could have just been the floor. I would have been happy.
Yeah.
And
No,
you'll
it's
notice in the
Halston's.
exhibition that there are all kinds of ways that we've made those contact sheets visible by blowing them up, by making them wallpaper.
Yeah.
You can see it behind us here. So, but Richard, I wonder, I know you have a favorite
Oh, yeah.
photograph in the show, a favorite image.
I have several favorites, like Our Lady of Perpetual Help Business School is one. But right near it, there's a photograph that I love, which actually Warhol took in London. And he often photographed signs, as we've already mentioned. This was a look right sign, when you're on the street. And we have that on the contact sheet, but what he did was cropped out the R, so it just says look. And I really take that, and it's the very first photograph you see in the show if you turn to your left, right when you enter the galleries. And I really took that, for me, that's what Warhol taught me. He taught me to stop always looking, or not that I always do, but when I look, not to look necessarily as an art historian would, or as I would in my particular historical moment, or from my perspective, but to actually look at things I don't think are interesting, but that Warhol did. And in the way he did, he makes them compelling, or can. It's not, and to take a look right photograph and make it, sign, and make it into a sign urging you to look, I just thought was a kind of profound. Also, that's what sort of I do as an art historian. I'm constantly saying to my students, just look at it. Tell me what you see. Look at it more closely. Look at it again. Don't just look at it for a second like it's a meme or something.
So it kind of becomes the message of the exhibition in
for
a way.
Me, I wouldn't try to project, impose that on everyone, but. Well, I don't know if
we
it's
want them to look, though,
yes,
Richard.
Please look. Warhol is telling you from beyond the grave to look.
At all 130,000 images.
I want to give one piece of credit, not only one, but one publicly to Susan, which is we originally had many, many more objects in the show. And Susan said, often in curating, less is more. And I said no.
All the time.
I said for Warhol, more was always more. But what I learned is we could only follow the logic of Warhol, to a certain extent.
And I think we actually ended up with the perfect number of objects in the gallery.
And it's still pretty maximalist, I feel like.
Yep. I want to talk about, or I would like to hear the two of you talk about, the fact that Warhol carried around that camera everywhere for the last 10, 11 years of his life and took pictures of everything. And of course, in the late 70s, early 80s, that was incredibly unusual to show up at a party with a camera, to have the camera in the supermarket. But now, of course, we all have cameras in our pockets all the time. So how, I wonder about that relationship. How has thinking about Warhol's perpetual photo taking made you think differently about this moment's perpetual photo taking, and how is this moment's constant photographing, I mean, we could hear the clicks happening now, right, affect the way that we look at Warhol?
Yes. So as I alluded to before, the subtitle of this enterprise is Photography Without End. And so I think on a very kind of simple way, Warhol was prescient about our own habits with cell phones. I think it's really clear that his daily practice, what I would call a performance practice, was to click at least 36 times every day. And I think that was part of a kind of larger interest in durational performance. But you'd have to read the catalog to really be persuaded by that. But anyway, that's one way of thinking about what's happening. So there's obviously a connection to our own habits with cell phones. But I think a more interesting way maybe is beyond that, that Warhol in the early 60s was going to Times Square, to the photo booths, and looking at grids of images and using those grids for his silk screens. And what he does at the very end of his life, his last show, was called Stitched Photos, and it was at the Robert Miller Gallery. And I happened to see it, not intentionally, by accident, which was for 3 years. I just had a very accidental life between 85 and 88. So I stumbled into this gallery, and it was surrounded with these grids of photographs that Warhol had, not himself, but Warhol and his team had sewn together. And it felt like an environment. And what we wanted to look at was the way in which the ubiquity of photography now really links to this notion of photography without end in Warhol's own career. And the final thing I'll say about it, which I think is really interesting, and again, I don't know if my daughter's here, but anybody who has a teenager, there's this habit, if you go to a party, everybody picks up each other's phones, and many people are actually the author of the photographs in a camera. It's not as in analog photography that the artist is the one who clicks. So in Richard's essay in the catalog, he traces some of the missing photographs. And we've also been able to demonstrate that there's so many photographs of Warhol that Warhol's contact sheets actually encompass the whole kind of photographic practice of sharing cameras, moving cameras around. And so when we say this is called Contact Warhol, we're also trying to suggest all of the contacts that are in the contact sheets. And yeah, so there's more to say, but yeah.
Thank you. It'll kind of be interesting to see people in there taking pictures of the pictures.
You're most welcome to do so. Yes.
I did. I am teaching a class this quarter called Warhol's World. It's a sort of sequel to the class that Peggy and I taught. She wasn't available to co-teach her, or that's what I would have preferred. But because it was, I really learned a huge amount from our collaboration.
So did I.
But
I hope that's clear. I'm joking, but really. Oh my God. Yeah.
What I said to one of the students in the class when I was trying to describe not only the context sheets, but the context sheets in relation to the show and the fact that we have selected a few frames to print that Warhol himself did not select, which we do have, Stanford has the legal right to do, but I think it raises all sorts of curatorial questions. And it's also the case that the Andy Warhol Foundation, almost 30 years after Warhol died, created sewn photographs, including all the ones that are in the Cantor collection, based on the actual prints that Warhol had made to make sewn photographs, but he died. And I said to the students, when people die, usually that's the end of their work, because they can't make it. But in Warhol's case, he keeps being reinvented. But what I said to the student was, think of it like the photographs you would delete on your phone, all the ones you don't like. But in Warhol's case, we have all those deleted cell phone photographs, as well as the ones he actually chose. So we have, in a way, an archive that traces his entire visual sensibility. For the second it took to click the shutter release, he thought that what he was photographing was of visual interest, even if later on, for reasons we can't know, it paled or it waned in interest. And the last thing I'll say, I promise, is that there were cases where Peggy and I, or one of us, or both of us, actually thought the most interesting frame on the context sheet was not one of the ones Warhol chose for printing. And that's because his sensibility is not necessarily about the best in terms of how we might look at composition, lighting, cropping, and so forth.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And one of the things that hasn't been mentioned is when you look at the contact sheets, you'll see that they are marked up. You'll see the active choice making that was undertaken in the examination of the contact sheets. So I think Richard actually said something that is the perfect end of the loop in that you are teaching from the exhibition. So this is an acquisition, something that's come to the museum that has served the university really well. It was used as the impetus for the exhibition that you're seeing now, for the catalog that I'm sitting on. Next to. And now we are able to use it for teaching in the gallery. So it's just the perfect manifestation of a collection coming here and being used in really productive ways by the faculty, by the students, and here in the setting of the museum. So thank you very much for everything that you've made possible.